Very much, Mr. Speaker.
Hang on. Just before I call a member, could I just ask for discussions to be, if you want to speak out in the lobbies, that's fine. Can you just lower the tone? It's called Stuart Nash.
Me lower the tone, Mr. Speaker, or these characters? Oh, sorry, Mr. Speaker. Look, Mr. Speaker, I stand in support of the Courts and Criminal Matters Bill, but there are 3 points I would like to make. First of all, this bill, they're very good points. This bill is long overdue, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Rick Barker, who was Minister of the Courts in the last government, had a bill very much like this already drafted on the order paper and ready to go. If Labor had been in government, this would have been well and truly done and dusted about 2 years ago, Mr. Speaker. The second point I would like to make is the reason why Labor supports this bill is because Labor has always supported bills that support common sense, fiscal integrity and get money back. This is a common sense bill, Mr. Speaker, and why is this a common sense bill? It is a common sense bill because, of course, it is a Labor bill. Well, based on Labor principles that I mentioned were brought forward by the Honourable Rick Barker. The third point I would like to make is this is an absolutely necessary bill. Cam Calder waxed lyrical, one of his quotes again, it wasn't Shakespeare or Plato or some other philosopher. He said that the Select Committee acted in a very cordial manner when it passed this bill. And of course it did, Mr. Speaker, because there is no contention about this whatsoever. It is a common sense bill. We all agree with it. I think all of New Zealand agree with it, and it's going to be passed tonight with unanimity. And I think that's great. But, Mr. Speaker, there are a couple of figures that I would actually like to tell the people of New Zealand because they're a little bit shocking, actually. Figures released earlier this year, and we've heard a few figures tonight from Cam Calder and a couple of my colleagues, but they show between July 2008 and June 2009, courts wiped $95.1 million out of a total of $806 million in unpaid fines. That is amazing. $800 million in unpaid fines. You've got to ask, what is going on? $800 million. That's amazing. How many night classes is that? How many early childhood education centres is that? It's a hell of a lot. How many people in Napier would benefit from $800 million into their economy? A hell of a lot more when Labor's in power, I'll tell you that, Mr. Speaker. But this bill seeks to address these concerns about the amount of overdue fines. The dissatisfaction of victims and offenders, and I can well imagine, Mr. Speaker, if I was a victim of crime, the court had imposed a fine or a reparation to be paid to me from the offender and it's not paid. That just rubs salt into the wound. This bill will help address that too, Mr. Speaker. So that's right. That is right. This will address that fundamental principle of fairness. And that is a fundamental principle. When my children are playing and they're not getting on, the thing they say is, Dad, that's not fair. That's right. That is not fair. Right. And I think that's certainly what this party stands for, Mr. Speaker, and what we've sort of highlighted through the two terms. It's about fairness. Sometimes it's about, fairness to the people of New Zealand. So this government seems to sort of miss the point there. But this is about fairness to the victims of crime. This bill helps that, Mr. Speaker, and that's why I'm supportive of that one. Of that, there is no doubt. But one of the questions I put forward, or one of the points I would like to make, Mr. Speaker, is I wonder why this bill has taken so long to come before the House. Why has that been? It was practically done before the Labor government left. As I mentioned, the Honourable Rick Barker, he had drafted such a bill. It was ready to go. We gave it to you. You are tough on crime. You are too, Mr. Speaker. Simon Power has stood up here and delivered speeches around how the National Party is tough on crime. 2 years for this one. 2 years. How tough is that? Anyway, I asked that question. I have no answer to it, Mr. Speaker, because there is no good answer. But what this bill does also, Mr. Speaker, is it omits some of the proposals developed by Labor. For instance, we wanted to create a single agency responsible for fines. Did you know, did anyone here know there are actually now about 80 agencies that are responsible for the collection of fines? That is astounding. This would have helped with the compliance, it would have helped with the efficiency, would have streamlined the whole process. And I asked the Minister, is that one of these supplementary order papers that the Minister was going to put in here to sort of streamline this whole process? Because all we hear from that party is about streamlining process. Labor put in an idea to streamline it and it was thrown out. Can't understand that, Mr Speaker. The Justice Ministry research shows that when young people cross a certain threshold of money owed, it's around about $2,000, they become unable or unwilling to even pay that fine. And that's a lot of money for a young person, Mr Speaker. It's a lot of money for many, many New Zealanders who are actually facing increased costs due to GST rises, etc., etc. This is a lot of money. And given that large and growing amounts of outstanding penalties, the effectiveness of monetary penalties as a sanction for offending is being eroded, Mr Speaker. And that comes back to the whole point of $800 million in outstanding fines. But I have a concern about this, and Keith Locke talked about this before. What they will do, what this bill proposes, is with people who aren't paying their fines, lending companies and the wider community will get that information. So it's sort of a naming and shaming thing. Now, Mr Speaker, today I was at a conference at Victoria University which talked about inequality. And Keith Locke is dead right when he said that a bill like this may in fact increase inequality amongst New Zealanders in our communities. And that is something that I will fight incredibly hard for as long as I am in Parliament, Mr Speaker, because inequality is like a rot eating the heart out of our community. This may well increase inequality, and we must fight that at every turn, because what we're finding here, Mr Speaker, is that people get to a point where they cannot pay their fine. We showed that. They cannot pay their fines. What Labor actually proposed is to put young people with large amounts of fines within a case management system. So what they have to do is they acknowledge, I have a debt, I have done wrong, I have a debt, let's work out a system to pay this fine. That was not taken up. Instead of managing that process, Mr Speaker, this bill proposes to name and shame. And I for one, have a real problem with that, and as mentioned, the level of inequality. Now, a couple of my colleagues have mentioned John Maynard Keynes, which I found quite interesting. It was quite a good quote, but I'll tell you, I very much doubt John Maynard Keynes ever had outstanding fines, but I'll tell you one thing he did say about equality, Mr Speaker. He said, you give tax cuts to the top, that will not stimulate the economy. You give tax cuts to the bottom and it'll drive an economy out of recession, Mr Speaker. That's what he said. That is a lesson that this government has not learned, and as a consequence, this economy will suffer. And I feel sorry for the people of New Zealand. I feel greatly sorry for the people of New Zealand. Because, Mr Speaker, 650 people in this country have a declared income of $1 million or more, and they have just received $1,000 a week in the hand tax cut.
That's not fair.
$1,000 a week. And, Mr Speaker, I can imagine that if they had fines, they could pay them off straight away.
That's not equity.
Straight away. If you're on the median wage in Napier, you've got less than $5. And that has been eaten up and eroded by increases in the cost of living in GST and ACC. And they will not be able to pay their fines. In fact, this is what I'm talking about with regard to inequality. Not only does it drive wealth down, they get named and shamed and they become more and more disenfranchised with the whole political process. And we all lose. We all lose. Mr Speaker, there's one point I would like to make here, and this is something I was completely unaware of until I read this bill, and I suspect the vast majority of New Zealanders are unaware of this. The police and many territorial authorities actually have a policy to waive infringements on expired warrants of fitness or out-of-date registrations for 1 month or less when the fault is remedied in a timely manner. I didn't know this. I put my car to get a service. I went away to Parliament, I came back, picked it up, parked it to go and visit constituents, which I spend my day doing. And then what happened? I came out and there was a ticket on my window. $200 ticket for a week overdue. Thank you very much, Napier City Council. Anyway, so I went off and paid this. But, Mr Speaker, I urge any New Zealander who gets a fine on their windscreen for an unpaid registration or unpaid warrant, out-of-date warrant within a month, as soon as you get that, as soon as any New Zealander gets that, write a letter write a letter to your local council, write a letter to the Ministry of Transport, whoever, and ask